Right. Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Juan Matute. I am the Deputy Director of the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Road to Repair, Transforming Infrastructure to Environmental Justice, a mini symposium from the UCLA Institute of UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies. Sorry, you should know that. I've worked here for 16 years. So welcome. So I'd like to start just with some ground rules and acknowledgements before I hand it over to our moderator for today. So we are recording this event. It is in the Zoom meeting format to facilitate interaction and the Zoom breakout sessions later, but we ask that you please keep your video off and microphone muted unless called upon for Q&A or during, you can keep that on during the breakout sessions. Um, if you are looking for translation, we recommend using Zoom's a built-in captioning tool. So you can look for the show captions portion of the Zoom menu, which may be after more. It's the yeah, you might have to click more and then click the up arrow to enable translation and then click save if that's something that you need. I'd like to acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. As a land-grant institution, UCLA pays its respects to our ancestors, elders, and relatives, past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge some of the sponsors for our annual Arrowhead Symposium, who we also acknowledge in these mini symposias. So those are Los Angeles Metro, California's Resilient and Innovative Mobility Initiative, the Automobile Club of Southern California, MTC and SCAG, MPOs in the Bay Area and Los Angeles, as well as WSP. Several state agencies and technology companies are symposium this year is on new mobility, automated vehicles, and cities. And then I'd also like to note that we are celebrating or acknowledging 100 years of transportation research and education at UCLA this year. A few years ago, looking through the back files in the archives of the UCLA library, we found that in October of 1925, the University of California in Los Angeles established a transportation research center with a monetary gift that they received. That center was short-lived. It moved off to an East Coast university in 1926, but it marked the beginning of transportation research at UCLA before it even moved to the Westwood campus. So today's agenda, and these times are in Pacific Standard Time, is we will start with a panel on impacts and inequities of freeway construction. And then after that, move to a second panel, solutions and opportunities in freeway removal, before at the end of the symposium, moving to breakout groups. So that'll use Zoom's breakout feature and give you all an opportunity to connect with each other and learn from one another. And several of the speakers will be staying for those breakout groups. So now I would like to introduce with great pleasure my colleague, Dr. Reagan Patterson, who has directed and is moderating this mini symposium. Dr. Patterson is an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering in UCLA's Samueli School of Engineering. And Dr. Patterson, would you like to introduce the first panel?
Sure. And so I will, um, before going into our wonderful first panel, I'll just give some brief remarks and then introduce our fabulous panelists.
Okay.
Great. And so if I can share, hopefully everyone can see these slides.
Yes, I can.
Beautiful. So, good morning, good afternoon, good evening for some of you. Thank you to the UCLA Institute of Transportation Studies for convening this important conversation on the road to repair, transforming infrastructure to advance environmental justice. And so this mini symposium really sits at the intersection of three bodies of work, which are all very important to my own work. One, environmental justice scholarship. Two, transportation planning, history, and policy. And three, emerging theories of reparative, restorative, and retrospective justice. And so I want to briefly take a moment to situate our discussion within each. And so this conversation builds upon decades of environmental justice scholarship. So I do want to take a moment to recognize that this is a moment that has built on a lot of work, particularly that work of Dr. Robert Bullard with his book, Highway Robbery, Transportation Racism, and New Routes to Equity, which documents how transportation policy and urban planning systematically reinforce racial, economic, and environmental injustice. And across the country, those most excluded from safe, reliable, and accessible transportation are low-income people and people of color. And so this exclusion constrains physical and social mobility, limits economic opportunities, undermines health, and perpetuates daily indignities and frustration. In addition to that, highway construction and expansion impose significant environmental burdens, including elevated air and noise pollution. Environmental science, engineering, and public health research consistently shows racial ethnic disparities and exposure to traffic-related air pollution, reflecting the disproportionate concentration of freeway infrastructure in communities of color. And so Bullard's work sits at that intersection of transportation equity and environmental justice, highlighting that without deliberate intervention, transportation systems will continue to disproportionately harm communities along race and class lines. Then we get to more contemporary work like that of legal scholar and ACLU president Deborah Archer, who complements this work through several articles and most recently through the book Dividing Lines, How Transportation Infrastructure Reinforces Racial Inequality. And it's through this book that Archer demonstrates that after the fall of Jim Crow, transportation infrastructure became a mechanism to maintain segregation. And this work is part of a broader wave of this recent scholarship revisiting highway history and its afterlives. We have Justice in the Interstates, the Racist Truth About Urban Highways, which examines the deliberate routing of highways through Black, Brown, and low-income communities, looking at cases across the country. We also have City Limits, Infrastructure Inequality and the Future of America's Highways by Megan Kimball, which brings this national problem to life through contemporary reporting on highway expansions and removals through case studies across the nation. Then I do think it would be important to highlight the work happening not only here in California, but particularly from our University of California scholars, including that of Professor or Dr. Eric Avila, who in his book, The Folklore of the Freeway, traces how freeway construction in LA was intertwined with race, suburbanization, and urban revolt. And we have the research and scholarship of Dr. Anastasia Lukatu-Sedaris and colleagues looking case study across California of how the state disproportionately burdened communities of color through displacement and neighborhood severance. And this work is ongoing, highlighting the work of Dr. Paul Ong, who extends this analysis statewide. And so together, this growing body of scholarship describes how freeway harms are structural, cumulative, and deeply embedded, spanning social, economic, and environmental domains. And these harms are intergenerational, they are long-lasting, and they create layered injustices that intertwine race, class, and the environment. And so if freeway construction produces structural harm, what does justice then require now? And so we're seeing this, the emergence of scholarship around reparative and restorative approaches to infrastructure justice. And so in the recent paper, Infrastructure and Justice, a multi-scalar framework and review of epistemic, restorative, and reparative justice dimensions, Colin Yarbrough and Dr. Janelle Smith-Collin develop a framework that is especially useful here. They distinguish among epistemic justice, restorative justice, reparative justice. And it's this framework which pushes us to see freeway removal not simply as a design intervention, but as a potential vehicle for recognition, for institutional accountability, and for material redress. We get more scholarship from UCLA, like recent graduate Casey Chung, who examined how federally funded Reconnecting Communities pilot projects operationalize restorative justice principles on the ground. And unfortunately, the study finds that restorative intent does not automatically translate into restorative outcomes. Projects that lack enforceable anti-displacement measures, land use protection, shared governance structures end up reproducing the inequalities they seek to address. So freeway removal becomes a test case. Can infrastructure policy move beyond symbolic acknowledgement? Can we embed anti-displacement and wealth-building mechanisms into capital programs? Can we institutionalize community power and not just participation? So repair in this framing looks different in every community, but without material redistribution and true government change, we risk reconnection without justice. And at the same time, we have scholarship looking at freeway removal specifically, and it shows that it's not inherently transformative. That brings me to the scholarship of Dr. John Stalin, who argues that highway removal can offer a socio-ecological fix to the social, environmental, and mobility harms of mid-century freeway construction. And while projects, though, can reconnect communities and foster sustainable transport, in practice, removal often reproduces tensions in regional governance, carbon-intensive urban systems, and local development priorities. His work also highlights the often contradictory role of state governments, where departments of transportation prioritize system capacity and congestion avoidance, while state development and environmental goals can conflict with preserving traffic flow. And so, taken together, the scholarship underscores that freeway removal is not automatically justice. It's a contested political process embedded in state power, fiscal priorities, and regional growth regimes. And so that brings us to reconnecting communities. At the federal level, these ideas gained policy traction through the Reconnecting Communities program launched by the US DOT. And it was built, I want to highlight and emphasize, on the Every Place Counts design challenge, which was launched under the former Transportation Secretary Anthony Foxx, which provided technical assistance to 4 cities to develop plans for reconnecting neighborhoods. So this Reconnecting Communities program then moved from technical assistance to this funding, explicitly supporting planning and construction projects aimed at addressing harms caused by highways. Importantly, though, this federal shift did not emerge from just out of nowhere. It reflects decades of grassroots organizing, including efforts through the Freeway Fighters Network, from which one of our panelists is joining us today. But funding windows we see are very fragile, and dedicated reconnection funding is no longer guaranteed. And if we were to think of an analogy of the current administration's drill, baby, drill, I would offer expand, baby, expand is our current kind of paradigm, which raises the institutional question: if the federal moment recedes, what happens next? And so California embodies this contradiction of this moment. We see continued highway expansions. Under SB 695, Caltrans released data revealing how many homes and businesses were demolished between 2018 and 2023, where nearly all of the projects that were relocated occurred here in Los Angeles County. We see major freight and port corridor investments. We see ambitious, though, on the other hand, climate and EJ commitments and community-led campaigns. And so given this current political landscape, the question is, what is the path forward? How do we prepare for the next policy window to ensure investments truly repair past harms? And so while infrastructure regimes are durable, so are community movements. And so the challenge is, how do we align California's transportation and environmental planning with community-led visions for repair, reconnection, and equity? And so this is where I will leave you, and this is where I situate my own work, at the intersection of environmental justice, infrastructure justice, and transportation equity. This image here comes from a paper in which I examined the effects of removing and rerouting the Cypress Freeway in West Oakland on exposure to traffic-related air pollution and neighborhood change. And currently, my research continues to assess the impacts of freeway removal on air pollution, while also exploring how we conceptualize repair and redress. And so while it is important to frame this around research, we are an academic institution, I do want to be clear that some of the most transformative practices are already being led by frontline communities. So the question is not whether this knowledge exists, but whether institutions are prepared to act on it. And so as we move into panel 1 on impacts and inequities and panel 2 on solutions and opportunities, I invite you all to consider: what does genuine repair require? Who defines what repair looks like? How do we prevent reinvestment from becoming displacement? How do we build systems change so future generations do not have to repair what we build today? And for the academics, how does research support these community-led visions? So I look forward to getting into the conversation. And so with that, I would like to introduce the panelists. And so for the first panel, we are joined by Adam Paul Susanek, who is an architect and urban planner researching how transportation and housing policy have been used as instruments of physical division within urban areas, and how we can reconnect communities divided by the infrastructure choices of the past. His project, Segregation by Design, aims to catalog the destruction caused by mid-century urban renewal and highway projects, and to highlight the work advocates are doing to heal the divide. Adam is a project manager at AECOM, working on transportation projects both in the Benelux and in the Northeast US, and is pursuing his PhD in urban planning at the Delft Institute of Technology in the Netherlands. Welcome. Next, we have Demetria Murphy, who is an equity architect, researcher, organizational strategist, and facilitator who seeks to build power with those divested and disenfranchised and leverage the reparative potential of public lands, funding, and infrastructure, centering an ethic of care. As a senior associate at Estelano Advisors, Demetria led the team's development of the restorative justice framework for the city of Pasadena that will guide a new master plan, specific plan, to reconnect communities surrounding a portion of land formerly in the SR 710 ditch, addressing the legacy impacts of car-centric planning, racist ideologies, and its displacement of thousands of residents and their descendants, and envisioning new possibilities for the site. Demetria is also a steward of Alt Home LA, a creative residency, cultural archive, and community gathering space in Westmont, Athens Harbor Gateway North, leading the South Menlo Avenue Community Mapping Project, and a board member at Power California. Demetria holds a BS in Foreign Service from Georgetown University and an MA in Urban Planning from UCLA. Go Bruins! Welcome, Demetria. Next, we're joined by Delia Ortega. Delia Ortega is the Southern California Program's co-director at Communities for a Better Environment, where she advances environmental justice and equitable transportation outcomes. Raised in Southeast LA, she brings a lived understanding of industrial pollution shaped by her family's work and proximity to the city of Vernon. She spent 7 years at CBE as a community organizer, leading park equity efforts and the campaign to stop the I-710 South Freeway widening. She holds a BA in history from Williams College and a master's in urban and regional planning from UCLA. Another Bruin. Welcome. And our final panelist is Amy Castaneda. As a product of the South Bay and San Diego County, Amy is passionate about uplifting the issues that disproportionately impact underserved communities. Through her work, she's committed to continuing to build the next generation of community organizers. Amy studied public policy and public health at Arizona State University, and through her work as a community organizer, Amy has worked on various local, state, and federal political campaigns. Before joining Environmental Health Coalition, Amy worked for the first supervisorial district at the County of San Diego, where she served as a policy advisor and small business liaison overseeing issues related to homelessness, public safety, small business stimulus grant, behavioral health, and reproductive health. Amy also served as a campaign manager for a state assembly race in her hometown. She's an experienced campaign manager that focuses on leveraging a grassroots strategy to consistently garner the support of labor organizations and EJ organizations. Prior to her role as a campaign manager, Amy was a community organizer at Planned Parenthood of the Pacific Southwest, where she helped bridge the need for reproductive health in the South Bay community and established the first ever Planned Parenthood Generation Action Club in 2 South Bay high schools. And so welcome, Amy. And so to get us going, I'd love to first turn to Adam. If you can first discuss how historical freeway construction, particularly in California, along with urban renewal policies, shape today's communities.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for that really great introduction. You touched on some of those impacts. But I'll elaborate a little bit more, starting by going back into history. So what is the impact of historical freeway construction today? So talking about freeway construction, talking about when it started in earnest with the interstate highway in particular, that started in 1956, and was really created against the backdrop of the civil rights movement and federal integration. Brown v. Board of Education was just 2 years prior to the creation of the interstate. And in a lot of ways, highway construction and urban renewal becomes, as you mentioned, a critical tool for leaders who are opposed to desegregation to really fight against the civil rights agenda and essentially encourage and lock in segregation to the built environment. Because prior to this era, planners and local leaders around the country had really relied on a sort of patchwork of racist housing policies, like explicit racial zoning, restrictive covenants, to uphold a level of segregation in essentially every city, the South, obviously, but every city in the United States. And outside of pure racism, this was, largely motivated by economic reasons. It was accepted in the real estate industry that non-white residents reduce property values, and that was something that was explicitly federally endorsed with the creation of redlining in 1934. But so in the 50s and 60s, with the civil rights movement, as the legal basis for segregation is falling in the courts, highways become a means to advance a few different counter strategies. And I'll go over a few of those right now. And those are the impacts that we feel to this day. So firstly, there's the direct displacement of non-white communities through highway construction. This was especially true in neighborhoods adjacent to downtown areas, speaking generally across the country, which were becoming more and more non-white due to white flight, as well as the ongoing Great Migration. And this was thought to reduce downtown property values. So a highway could take out some of these neighborhoods to protect downtown property values. So the 710 in Pasadena, right adjacent to downtown Pasadena, the four-level interchange near downtown LA. So direct displacement is one, and then containment is another way that these highways become Jim Crow again. So containment, highways could be used as physical dividers to create distance between black and white neighborhoods, while attempting to stop the spread of non-white areas. And severing local streets to reduce mobility. So this is the 110 in LA, attempting to stop the spread of black residents to the west side and north, and the 980 in Oakland. And then third, um, the highways really reorient the entire city's transportation system to facilitate regional and commuter automobile travel over local non-automobility over anything else. And back then and today, still car ownership is a mark of race and class. And these highways became the largest investment in a city, or sorry, in a system that treated the ease of automobile commuting over the well-being of communities along the way, while physically occupying the same space that the Pacific Electric had to get in downtown Los Angeles, um, removing a lot of the public transit routes as well. So in an era of white flight, the highways become a means to sort of physically reconnect these middle class areas, um, the labor and capital that had left, to physically reconnect those to the downtown core with these highways while cutting through the inner city in between. So the highways become a means to really support the suburbs by connecting them to downtown and reorient our whole transportation system around that. So today the result is, as you mentioned, you know, there's far more highways passing through non-white neighborhoods. And with that, the exposure to higher asthma rates, more pedestrian deaths, all of those public health impacts. And then importantly, and I'll end here, importantly, we're left with a transportation system that is really designed to support the mobility of some over the direct health, wealth, and well-being of others.
Thank you. And I think that history helps contextualize, and I think it also helps set us up for the next question to dive more into LA specifically. So, what are those impacts, if you can expand on them, the social, the environmental, the health impacts of freeway projects such as the 105 and other transportation corridors like ports and freights here in LA, but also will have similar impacts elsewhere? If Demetria or Amy to speak to that.
Yeah, I can jump in. Thanks, Dr. Patterson, and thank you, Adam. I'm thinking a lot about, again, right, like the sort of origin of urban renewal policies, and really prioritizing blight, right? Again, this idea of slum clearance. And I think that there's a sort of gaze, right, that the state has around slums that, really take height in urban renewal. And so just to kind of dig into some of the impacts that Adam, shared, use again, coming off the racist logic of the Hulk fire insurance maps. A lot of the impacts really led to displacement, right, of communities, right, that were sort of in formation. You have, again, an example in Pasadena, ARG, the Architectural Resources Group, did a great report in the work, really to sort of ground the historical impact of the 710 and the sort of 710 ditch that ultimately was not developed. And that land has recently been returned to the city by Caltrans. And they found that 117 residential buildings with 168 housing units were demolished, 50 commercial buildings, 8 industrial buildings. And so you have, thriving community institutions, places like First AME Church that were essentially demolished because of the effort of highway construction. I will plug a really fabulous documentary that Allegra Consulting did, really uplifting the oral histories of folks in Pasadena, Black, Brown, Asian families who were displaced, again, by the impacts of the 710 as well as the 210. Um, I think the economic loss, right, is something that, we're still understanding. The economic loss of homes, jobs, businesses. Really, again, I think right now, that has been quantified between 100 and 200 billion dollars of economic loss, particularly with Black folks in the United States because of highway construction. And so thinking about all of that generational wealth that has been lost because of highway construction. And then I think, the sort of piece, I think, sort of Dr. Reagan mentioned, as well as Adam, around, this fragmentation and severance. With the Menlo Avenue Mapping Project, we are doing oral histories of descendants and current residents who have been impacted by the freeway construction of the 105. And thinking about, family hubs, for example, right? Alt Home was a previous family hub, and there was a cousin who lived again in the area of the freeway siting who was relocated due to the freeway siting, and had to relocate all the way to the IE. And so, really, just thinking about, some of those local community hubs that have been obliterated by freeways. And then I think that really connects to the psychological impacts, right? This erasure of spatial memory really contributes, to what Dr. Mindy Thompson Fullilove calls root shock, right? This idea of sort of taking plants, and them not necessarily having a root. And I think that that is something that plagues communities who have been displaced, right, for reasons of highway construction, but reasons, again, for also, a ton of other public projects, right? We see this with stadiums, we see this with a lot of sort of publicly funded projects. I think, I just kind of spoke to the shadow side, but I will kind of touch on, I think two potential, positive impacts, right? If I, dare to frame it that way. Something that we're learning again in our oral histories with the Menlo Avenue Mapping Project is this concept of regional access, right? Folks who, were, in the Westmont Athens community now could access jobs, in other parts of the county, allowing them to sort of make income in that way. And then I would be remiss to not, talk about the origin of, this deep organizing and advocacy that has come out in response to freeway siting. And so thinking about the 1972 class action lawsuit, Keith versus Volt, which really sort of launched, again, this term, the freeway fighters, right? And this was a coalition of the NAACP, the Sierra Club, the Environmental Defense Fund that really coalesced, and it resulted in a 7-year halt to the construction of the 105. It really scaled down the design from a 20-lane highway to a 10-lane. And then, was further scaled from there. And then it also launched the creation of the Century Freeway Housing Program, which was a court-mandated program to really sort of provide some of that housing that was obliterated from the from the actual freeway construction. I'll pause there and pass it to Amy.
Thank you so much, Demetra. Hi, everyone. Very happy to join you all here. As Dr. Reagan was mentioning, I am based out of the San Diego area, so I will definitely be talking about some of the impacts down in San Diego. So I'm going to specifically also talk about the community of Barrio Logan, which is one of the core communities in which we work in. Barrio Logan, just to kind of give you all context, is a primarily dominantly Hispanic low-income community just south of downtown San Diego. And this is actually a community that was split in half when the 5 freeway was first constructed. And I will say that this was a community that is also adjacent to the Port of San Diego. So there is a lot of port industry that is attracting a lot of diesel pollution from the heavy duty trucks that are, getting all those materials and products that come in from the Port of San Diego into throughout the San Diego County, and not just in the city of San Diego, but also down south in the community of National City. So actually, before the 5 freeway was set to be constructed, it was set to run along Harborside Drive, which is actually the street that is like right next to the Port of San Diego. Unfortunately, because of just poor planning and a lot of community engagement, they decided to build the 5 freeway and actually cut again Barrio Logan, which then created 2 separate communities, which is Barrio Logan and now Logan Heights. This community, again, like I mentioned, has a lot of diesel pollution. And what we see and what that translates to is that a lot of the youth and a lot of the seniors in our community are disproportionately impacted by asthma rates. About 2 to 3 times higher. We'll see a lot of asthma hospitalization in minors, the ages from five and under, because of the diesel particulate matter. We see a lot of high asthma, high cancer rates, low birth rates within newborns, and that's just kind of a lot of the things that we see. So one of the things that Environmental Health Coalition has been trying to do is to think creatively and also bringing in our communities to really identify solutions as to how do we minimize these impacts. I know a lot of folks talked about like the social economic and just like the social impacts, but we really focus on how do we clean up our air. And in the last 45 years, we have, taken the port to court. We have tried really implementing truck routes to really minimize how often our youth and our families are being exposed to diesel particulate matter. And I will say, it's been a really tough fight. And it's actually taken us, again, 45 years to really accomplish some of these things, like, again, simply establishing a truck route. One thing that I will mention is that even like passing our own, when Barrio Logan was trying to pass their community plan update, was just one of the oldest community plans in the county. We actually saw a lot of resistance from primarily part of the port tenants. Barrio Logan, we organized our community members back in like the early 2010s. We did a lot of community input as to what folks wanted to see in terms of, getting just like how do we look at affordable housing? Again, all these things. And our community plan update was actually put on a referendum. The port tenants were out there organizing against us, saying that if we pass the community plan update again, that would have a truck route that would really prioritize creating a buffer zone, that we would lose 20,000 jobs. They were straight up lying to our community members and saying that it was going to be really bad for San Diego economics. There was an actual independent report that was done that actually said that they were lying, and that if we did pass the community plan update, we were actually going to create 5,000 jobs. So all this to say is that this is a community that has time and time again, we see that it's really been like profit over people. And what we are trying to do at Environmental Health Coalition is really empower people, give them tools, give them the knowledge. And we also know that like it's not just, having a degree that's going to, help people, dictate what they want to see. It's also really about lived experience. And that's what that's kind of what we like to really focus on at Environmental Health Coalition, is using those lived experience to go out and actually advocate for what people want. And I'll get into the solutions because that's what I really want to get into, but I don't want to get too ahead of myself. I'll pass it over to Delia or Dr. Reagan.
Thank you so much, and just providing that rich history. And so, this is why I like the archival work that you're doing, Demetria, and just that or on the ground organizing, Amy, to really be able to speak to local experience and again add that extra contextualization and grounding. And so, that also provided a smooth transition, I believe, to Delia around because Amy started to get community organizing, community empowerment. We see, as I presented in my introductory slides, I mean, this is continuing to happen. Freeway construction, freeway expansion, it's continuing, and Caltrans is continuing to prioritize these projects. And so, how have communities organized to resist or influence freeway projects, such as you're organizing with 710?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I'll be talking about the 710 South portion of the proposed widening. And there's also a lot of connections with what the other panelists have been sharing around the connections to the ports, right? As we know, the 710 is connected. It's central to the LA goods movement infrastructure, connected to the ports of LA and Long Beach. Yeah, and I'll just start off that back in 2000, when Caltrans announced that they had plans to widen the freeway to literally double it from 8 to 16 lanes. People were mad, right? People had found it a need to organize, not because it was like an abstract policy debate, but because it was rooted in survival. People have no other choice. The 710 freeway has already been dubbed a diesel death zone because of the elevated truck traffic. We have a lot of asthma, cancer clusters. So this, yeah, became a very much life or death fight. And our organizing was incredibly strategic. When Caltrans announced the proposed widening, the Coalition for Environmental Health and Justice formed, which brings together legal advocates, technical experts, and also community-based organizations that are anchoring the organizing from East LA to Long Beach. And so a lot of our organizing has been rooted in or has been anchored by three organizations: East Yard Communities for Environmental Justice, the Long Beach Alliance for Children with Asthma, and also Communities for a Better Environment. And so the structure has allowed for the strategy to be rooted in grassroots leadership and not dictated through like policy, although policy has obviously informed it, right? But we are really trying to center grassroots leadership and lived experience. And so for us, a lot of it has been around reframing the narrative from mobility towards health and pushing for a genuine community process that works to shift the framing. So, as we talk about our campaign and as we talk around the 710 highway, we want to remember that it's not just about moving the goods and moving the trucks, but also about the people that live, work, play around the highway. And so this has been over a 20-year fight. The organizing has started long before I stepped in as an organizer as well. And it's been, yeah, really strategic. And I think it speaks to a lot of the long-term relationship building that has made this campaign such a success. And so a lot of it has just been rooted in like old school organizing, door knocking, ensuring that people who live directly near the freeway are even aware of the project, because at the time Caltrans wasn't doing that, right? Like they weren't letting people know that like their home was at risk for displacement. They weren't letting people know that a lot of the air quality impacts that were to come. And it's been really important to see members start off 20 years ago and they're still engaged today. And I think that really also speaks to just like how, yeah, long-term infrastructure projects unfold. And yeah, a lot of our organizing has been around community capacity building, working with community members and our other coalition members to enable members to participate in the environmental review process, to understand like how does the freeway interchange work? What are complete streets? What are things that we can advocate for through this project that isn't just around like vehicles, miles traveled, and like how fast can my car get from point A to point B? And so that's been really important and really beautiful to see how our community members now show up to public meetings and are speaking from their lived experience and really advocating for a process or a project that's more comprehensive. And yeah, as our campaign went on, it boiled down to three demands: health, homes, and jobs. So a project that prioritized public health, a project that didn't displace people, and also a project that brought in local and targeted hire. And I think that's really important because oftentimes the narrative around community organizing is that we're against infrastructure projects or that we're against agencies, right? But this was really a push to work more collaboratively. And, the 710 freeway as it stands needs a lot of repairs, right? It's a diesel dead zone. We need a lot of improvements. And so how can we ensure that community members have decision-making power and have a say in how the infrastructure will impact them? And yeah, we intervened at every layer of decision making, from Metro board meetings to, public project meetings, all the things. We were there. And yeah, we were able to successfully stop the widening back in 2022. But we're still engaged, right? We still want to make sure that as the project rolls out, that community members' priorities are still present. The goods movement still has a lot of influence. Supports are still there in the new iteration of the project. And so, yeah, we're just ensuring that community members are still being prioritized and that there's decision-making power for community members as they continue to engage.
Thank you. And so I know I've been following that work. Some of my colleagues here at UCLA have been engaged with the work happening. And so thank you for sharing that. And I think that then speaks also to Amy, what you were saying about empowering communities. So Delia, your point around how folks so many years later are still engaged, still a part of this work and now leading a lot of this organizing. And so what are some ways to empower community leaders and support solutions? And so, Amy, if you could speak to, for instance, the Reconnecting Communities grant.
Yeah, so actually, I can't speak too much on that particular grant because EHC was not a part of that grant. But what I can tell you is some of the strategies that we do, and we actually did receive a $29.5 million state grant from Transformative Climate Communities, and that'll help us, in the neighborhoods of Barrio Logan. And actually, I did see a friend from San Diego, Randy Van Black, somewhere in the audience, and he would be a really great resource on the RC grant. But what I can tell you about the strategies that we have employed is, again, EHC has been around for over 45 years in the community. Barrio Logan, Logan Heights, National City, Barrio, and City Heights. And what we do is that we really focus on that like one-on-one human connection and really like understanding what are the issues that people are facing. And we see it, it's kind of across the board of like folks are experiencing asthma, folks are not understanding what is causing their kids to, have these severe breathing issues. But beyond that, we're also seeing is that like we're seeing a lot of displacement and gentrification, specifically in Barrio Logan. So what we really, again, try to understand is what are folks experiencing, and then we try to connect them to the proper resources. We're an environmental health justice organization, but that doesn't mean that we don't engage in housing issues. So we really rely on our allies to bring those resources. But what we really like to do is, again, it's like really encouraging our folks to go out and provide public testimony, really building this leadership pipeline through our SALTA, which is Salud Ambiental Líderes Tomando Acción. And in English, that is Environmental Justice Leaders Taking Action. And it is a 10-week leadership development where we talk to folks about like what is EJ, what is public health. We talk about things like just engaging in local elections and stuff like that. But then we take it a step further of like, how can you get involved in local government agencies, whether it's SANDAG, which is our transportation committee down in San Diego, whether it's like at a city council hearing. And we really do this through like testimony prep and storytelling, really like conceptualizing that like all these policies have direct implications into people's lives and their daily lives. So, we'll take them through like, hey, we have a city council item. Let's talk about it. What does this mean to you? And again, it's really talking about like their lived experiences because no one knows how they're going to be impacted more than themselves as the resident that is living there. But what I will say is that, again, one of the things that beyond, this like testimony prep and really getting folks to eventually go to, take an action at city council or going up to Sacramento for a lobby day, we also really like to encourage folks to participate like in the AB 617 steering committee, which is the specific port side steering committee that brings together port tenants and it brings the government agencies together to really identify like how are the ways that we're going to clean up the port of San Diego, how are we going to meet our SERP, which is our, oh my god, acronyms this morning are not are very difficult. But anyways, all that to say, for us, it's really, again, empowering our community members in the last like 10 years, not 10 years, about like 10 years, we have really also engaged in like, even how do we look at our community planning groups. Like, as I mentioned earlier, when we were going through this whole referendum of like port tenants, telling community members whether the community plan that they worked so hard on was going to be good or not for them. All of those things, like we've been again encouraging people to get engaged, and again, most of our community members will tell us like, I don't have the educational background, this isn't for me. But through working with them and again educating them and like really exposing them to these government bodies, we have been able to have really successful stories of like, hey, anyone in your community and anyone in the community can be a leader, and really show up for the community. So yeah, I can also talk about our TCC grant and how we also engage like over 500 residents, but I want to be mindful of others. And yeah.
Thank you. And yes, definitely also an opportunity to talk with folks during the breakouts later, because there's so much to expand upon. And something that's been highlighted in all your responses is how intersectional this is, how it does touch upon housing, how it touches upon so many aspects of, as you said, the lived experience, one-on-one connection. And so it's also intersectoral. So that brings me to my next question around given who's in the audience, given who's on the panel and your various expertise, how do practitioners, consultants, and academia engage in partnerships with community around these issues? And what does an ethic of care look like in practice? And I'll turn to Adam and Demetria first.
Sure, I'll go first as the consultant, I guess, or as the person who works at a consulting agency or firm. You know, I'll get to that in a second. That's really important. I just want to briefly say on the historical angle, because folks have talked about freight movement, and I didn't really touch on that at all. One impact of dumping all this money into highways, the public money into highways, was we were basically funding freight rails, which was private, their direct competitor publicly. So we put a lot of short and medium distance freight rail and other means of freight movement out of business because we publicly subsidized trucking, basically. So in some place like New York, they're looking at reinstituting local freight rail, as well as reinstituting, and I don't want to step on the next panel's solutions thunder, but reinstituting short distance water-based transit, so barges. And where I live here in the Netherlands, they do a lot of that, and that might not be useful for Los Angeles, but for San Francisco, it could be for movement between Oakland and SF. But to the question of how do practitioners work with an ethic of care, you know, what what we do or what I've done in the projects I've been involved with, and it sounds kind of simple, but basically just we develop, we've been trying to develop the plan with the community. Talking specifically about the Cross Bronx and capping the Cross Bronx. And that sounds obvious, but rather than going with like a slate of different options, which is what Dallas is doing essentially. But a lot of cities will develop a series of options to present to the public that are technocratically, how did those get developed? They're done in-house at the DOT or at a consulting firm without much input. But what we're trying to do in New York, and New York State has really been great about this, is and it's not rocket science, but have the community really drive the design. The question is, how do you do that? Because not everyone is a practitioner, right? Like, where not everyone is a city planner. But I would venture to say city planning isn't necessarily that complicated. It's complex, but it's not necessarily. You can create methods to really engage folks. Working with large scale models of the Cross Bronx, so people can physically manipulate it, and developing designs that way with clay and with architecture models, but making it very simple. But to answer the question shortly, not that I've done that, but to put a point on it is really developing the designs with the community rather than just presenting designs as a fait accompli, especially because normally in like the Texas example, when Dallas is presenting, we can do a boulevard, we can do a cap or a removal. They intentionally make boulevard look incredibly complicated and removal look like it's going to be a traffic nightmare. So you can get around that. I mean, the leadership has to come from the state to some extent, but the way that the consultant actualizes that can really give the community some voice. I wish that there weren't necessarily the consultant that's a topic for a different time. But working with the community to develop the design.
Yeah, and so Dimitri, do you have anything to add about that, about community co-developing that design?
Yeah. I'll just quickly sort of, touch on, I think planning very much is future looking, right? We're looking at a plan 15, 30, 50 years from now. And I think in this work, when we're really talking about restorative planning, there really has to be a blend of honoring those stories, history, the grief, right? That I think is so very present in communities and pairing that with future models, right? And so taking a look at, for example, Pasadena, again, I sort of plugged all the resources that really, sort of assess the harm and really understand the sort of depth of impact there. But then, right, I think that to me is like the baseline for then what needs to happen in the future, right? So one of the restorative justice elements in the City of Pasadena framework is around historical acknowledgement, right? That's like baseline, right? All the, sort of, again, city, state really acknowledging the infrastructural harm. I think Rondo in St. Paul, which is a historic Black community that was bifurcated by a highway. I'm forgetting the number right now off the top, or Highway 95, or excuse me, 94, I-94. And the city of St. Paul and the state of Minnesota, right, issued a public and formal apology in 2015. And that I think was a springboard for what we see now, right? They're sort of about to start development on a cap to reunite again the two communities who were bifurcated by the highway. And so I think that again, really thinking about acknowledging the past as a way to really understand like what type of harm are you actually trying to address?
And that's just sorry, right? And that's exactly, and that's how you can make sure that capping projects don't become just the big dig, right? Which was an economic development project. It has to have that explicit equity acknowledgement and focus. Otherwise, you end up with, as Professor Pattison has written about, gentrification.
Yes, and so I do, maybe we can blend it together because I know we're running on close to time. And so looking ahead, and so acknowledging the harm. And so that's the intention of this panel, particularly, for instance, acknowledging the harm. And so then looking ahead. And so what do you envision? And I ask this of all of you before I open up briefly for Q&A. What do you envision as the future of equitable transportation planning and freeway policy, particularly in California? And in that, how do we have those investments or infrastructure improvements while preventing things like gentrification and displacement? So what is that vision, that future vision for all of you? And so anyone can feel free to start because I'd love for all of you to answer.
I just said something. I don't want to. I want to
Go
hold
ahead,
it.
Adam. You can kick us off.
I mean, affordable housing and uh, rent control, and I don't have the best answer for this, but this is these. So I should probably shut up. But basically, these capping projects and these removal projects, the point is it has to be holistic, right? Because you can't just deal with the highway, because the highway affects the land use on either side and has for 70 years. So you can't just cap it because then you're also potentially gentrifying. So you have to work with all these agencies, and it's an American thing, coordinate, because we don't treat land use and transportation as the same thing.
Mhm.
But coordinate and make sure that you develop anti-displacement strategies, which are out there. There's different levels of effectiveness, but affordable housing, also making sure that affordable housing means affordable, and rent controls and actually adopting anti-displacement strategies, which the RCP did not precisely do. It was an FHW. It was a highway project, right? Administered through the FHWA, not a housing project. It didn't really have any of those. So I'll have to read up on some of those things you said at the top there. That research sounds really interesting about the RCP.
Uh, Thank you. So holistic anti-displacement. Go ahead, Delia.
Yeah, definitely ditto on the interagency coordination. That doesn't happen enough. This is just like a problem that we constantly run into as environmental justice organizations. We're the ones doing the coordination between the housing, the transportation, all the agencies. We're always like caught in the middle. So definitely want to ditto that. And then yeah, I think having anti-displacement policies up front, right? Having concurrent efforts at CBE as we do organizing around infrastructure projects, urban greening. We're also working with cities to ensure that they have strong tenant protections, but also thinking about like what are other community ownership models, land banking, community land trust that can be integrated into projects. That's really important. And then, kind of moving towards like what does genuine community engagement look like, right? I think that's really important. And just like really valuing lived experience. Community residents understand truck routes, they understand asthma clusters, they're experts in their community, informal walking paths. So just really moving towards a system where that's valued and resourced is really important, right? Ensuring that community leadership has actual decision-making power in these structures.
I can jump in really quickly. I think ditto to everything you just shared, Delia, as well as Adam. I'll just add, I think again, this sort of like partnership piece, again, for me as, a consultant and a steward, really partnering in a way that's building that power, right? And so I appreciate a lot of the work, Amy and Delia, that you both are doing. Thinking about the Pasadena work, right? There was a, sort of co-developed Pasadena focused definition of restorative justice that the community advisory group aligned on. And then from there, I think to your earlier point, Adam, really thinking about what are clear goals with tangible outcomes, right? That really do the work of both redressing the harm, but I would also say, right, I think that there's a lot of sort of like future visioning, right? The groundwork needs to be laid now. And so in the Pasadena framework, specifically, there are a couple elements really that speak to intentional community benefits. Again, wanting the 710 master plan to beget that again for folks who have been impacted by the displacement that happened. Small business and workforce investment, thinking about impacted communities, wealth generation, right, to really address some of that. The generational economic loss that's happened, as well as potential, legislative outcomes, right, that will have reverberating impacts potentially for other projects, right? Thinking about the, upcoming 210 work, right? And so really thinking about, okay, how can we sort of take this moment, yes, acknowledge harm as like the baseline, but ensure that there are really sort of tangible benefits, right? That really impact those who have been disproportionately impacted by all of the impacts of freeway siting.
Awesome. And I will just end very quickly with I 100% agree with what the panelists have mentioned, but I think realistically, what we also need is investment. Like we actually need the state to allocate the funding to make sure that we are actually investing in some of these solutions, and also shifting away. And I didn't really get to talk too much into it, but like, how are we actually like shifting from freeways into actual into our transportation, our public transit system. Like I can tell you that San Diego has god awful transit options, and that's why it's just for some of our folks it's just easier to hop on in your car and just drive there yourself. And because there's just, at least in my county, these systems are not very well connected. So the funding and having like that transition is going to be key, because we don't, at the end of the day, that the folks that are most impacted by public transit systems are people of color. But yeah, I will stop there because I know we're running low on time. Back to you.
Well, thank you. And that ties to a comment in the chat around it's one thing to acknowledge even, but where we're placing the money. And so getting to your point, Amy, around the investments. And then briefly, one question, I'm going to put them kind of together. Someone asked, who is brought in and how as the community in planning with the community efforts? And so who's brought in and how as the community? And then tying that to another question, how do you build engagement and what is the community if there are different kind of parts of community who are advocating for different things? So who are we bringing in? Who is the community in these planning efforts, particularly if different segments of community want different things? And so anyone have response to that?
I'll just quickly jump in. I have an immediate answer. A lot of the work that, I've done with Pasadena as well as Alt Home LA has really been centering descendants, right? And so again, thinking about the sort of lineage of migration that, urban renewal has, sort of wrought, right? Like folks who, originated in a particular community a lot, are often rendered itinerant, right? They're moving around. You have the sort of example in Pasadena with folks who were displaced, who then were displaced to the, Pepper Street project. And then after that, they were displaced again, when that was demolished. And so thinking about descendants and really following that migrational lineage to really, again, center those and center those that are also currently affected by the environmental, the health, the social impacts.
Yeah, and to build off of that, I will add just like, yeah, thinking about like who is making up the room, right? Like, are we including tenants? Are we thinking about people that are carless? Are we thinking about people that are undocumented, right? Ensuring that we're thinking about the power structures and who is potentially most impacted by infrastructure projects is really important. And then also having like clear decision-making models to ensure that people at all layers, right, of power structures are able to meaningfully like see their input actually reflected into infrastructure.
And in the Bronx where we've been working, local organizations that are established, but we try to work with organizations that have a variety of different sort of reasons to exist. Tenant organizations, um, environmental protection. But the key is they're all, the Bronx River Alliance. Um, so we've been, because it's the Bronx, it's a story, it's a established storied community. Like we don't have to. We're lucky in that the community kind of comes to us, and because they have brilliant organizers there. So in New York, like maybe that question is actually easier than some other places, um, because we have brilliant community organizers. I'm not sure the exact point I'm trying to make, but it's the work that the community organizers on the panel are doing. I mean, it takes that sort of thing and engaging with those leaders, to ensure that a diverse cross section. Because right, you don't want to just plan. You don't want to just have your outreach meetings at like 10 a.m. on a work day, because that's not going to work. You have to have a bunch of them at different times, some of them online. So,
Yeah, intentionally engaging multiple aspects of community. Amy?
Yeah, I think for us, we've seen it in many ways where it's just like we see a government agency send out like a public notice, and for them, that's meaningful engagement. But to do this point earlier, it's just like, how are we making sure this is accessible to folks? And, Adam just mentioned it. It's just like, is it within working hours? Are you providing things like childcare, interpretation? And what we've seen in our communities is that like we have to make it accessible. If we really want meaningful engagement, it's up to the CBOs to make sure that, we're reaching out to
Mm.
the folks that, because we tend to also get the same, notices like, hey, participate in the survey. And we get it a lot where Caltrans will send us the survey. It's like, hey, do you mind, sharing X, Y, and Z with like your members? And we don't mind doing it, but it's one of those where it's like, it's not very, I don't know if it's intentional or unintentional, but the burden is put a lot on the CBOs. And I've had, very fruitful conversations where, we'll be very, very explicit of like, hey, we don't mind sharing these resources, but it's, again, it's just like we are nonprofits, we have limited resources. So like, how can you also put some of this money, back into the community and to ensuring that like we are getting the right folks to answer some of these surveys or provide some of this feedback. So yeah, I will end there.
Thank you all. And so that concludes our first panel. And I just appreciate all of you for so nicely situating this work, both historically, but how this continues today. Really, the need to center lived experience, whether it's in organizing, it's in research, it's as a practitioner, both in your work, but also in the solutions, who has the solutions, whose voices need to be represented, also there centering lived experiences, but not just a particular segment, but making sure that multiple aspects of community are represented. So I thank you so much for just the insights and just being able to draw from your own experiences in this work for me. And I've told the panelists before, I'm like just so excited to be in conversation with each and every one of them because of the work that you all do that I've followed for so long. So just thank you so much for your commitment to this and for commitment to showing up to community. And for those in the audience, if you want to continue, if you have questions that were not answered, and if you want to continue this conversation, most of our panelists will be staying on for the breakout sessions. And so that's an opportunity to continue the conversation with our brilliant panelists. So thank you so much. And with that, we will transition to panel 2. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, so panel 2 is solutions and opportunities in freeway removal. Reagan, I'll give you a bit of a break. I can introduce. So can we ask the speakers from this session to join? We have Dr. Ben Crowther, who is the policy director with America Walks, where he works with state and local advocates supporting mobility for all. Ben runs America Walks, building better streets, reconnecting communities, and safer vehicles for pedestrian campaigns. Welcome, Ben. We also have Randolph Bell, who's the executive director at EV Oak. He's the founder of EV Oak, a nonprofit advancing creative placemaking and equitable community development. He's also the co-founder and partner of Creative Development Partners and founder of RBA Creative, a business development center for the arts. Welcome, Randolph. And then we also have joining us Yesenia Perez, who's the Climate Equity Senior Program Manager at the Greenlining Institute. Yesenia is a policy advocate focused on systems change in climate resilience and community and clean mobility. She works with public agencies and community partners to shift how climate and infrastructure are designed, funded, and implemented to better serve communities in color. Welcome, and I'll let you take it from here, Reagan.
Thank you, Vaughn. And welcome to our panel 2 panelists. And so to get us going, we're going to hop right in. And so if you could just briefly share with the audience, what is your orientation to this freeway removal and transformative infrastructure solution? What brings you to this work? Oh, Randolph, you're muted. Oh, you're back.
Who's first?
You can go ahead. You've unmuted.
Oh, okay. And just for the record, it's Evoke. That was an obviously failed attempt at a rebranding. Uh, but my name is Randolph Bell. I do wear a few different hats. We've got 3 different entities, 2 LLCs, and a nonprofit that we operate under. So depending on the context, I'm typically just called that dude. I am not a UCLA person, but I have a daughter at UCLA in civil engineering with a transportation focus, totally by coincidence, and who thinks Dr. Reagan is a rock star. I approach the work not from an academic background, but I was a working artist for many, many years. We've got a real estate development consulting and investment company. Um, I was at a nonprofit for a long time that did community benefit negotiations on large scale real estate developments and municipal projects, the precursor to PolicyLink, same lineage there. And then I've got a background in environmental justice. So I facilitated the AB 617, the very first AB 617 EJ community here in West Oakland. And then I do for the Bay Area Air Quality Management District, I do the regional, which is all of the Bay Area, the 9 Bay Area counties, AB 617 communities. I typically, I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Ben or Yesenia?
I can hop in. First of all, I'm so happy to be here. So thank you for inviting me, Dr. Reagan. Yeah, my name is Yesenia Prez. I'm the Senior Program Manager of Climate Equity at the Green Lining Institute. We're a racial equity advocacy organization based in Oakland. We work at a state level as well as a national level. My work at Green Lining and really around freeway removal and transformative solutions is very much grounded in systems change. So I've done state level policy work. I've worked at the federal level under the Biden administration and just really view transportation as this larger piece of the puzzle that we've discussed and will continue to discuss today around climate resilience, housing, as well as economic opportunity. One of the projects that I am currently working on is an initiative called Homes Before Highway. It's an education campaign where we analyze state reported data under the SB 695 report and mapped where homes and small businesses have been demolished by highway expansion. And so, at the core of this work, we really believe in limiting displacement-driven highway expansion and redirecting funding towards clean mobility solutions like transit, safe streets, etc.
Welcome. And Ben.
Hey everyone, I'm Ben Crowther. Great to be here and great to see so many of you in the audience. Yeah, so I don't have a transportation background in any training. I was actually formerly an archaeologist who worked on streets, looking at streets as social spaces in the ancient Mediterranean world. And that sort of tints, my thinking about a lot of the work I do now. We have streets are our best public space. How can we turn streets to communities? I had a career transition at some point. I was working for the Congress for the New Urbanism, which is a urban design advocacy group, as program manager for their Highways to Boulevards program, looking at how to transform some of these highway corridors into more livable places that had community benefits. And I think the really big takeaway there was, getting rid of a highway didn't necessarily mean that you were repairing harm or benefiting communities that either historically lived there or were still living around the highway. So a lot of these projects grew up, the Highways to Boulevards projects grew up as economic development projects. And so a lot of my work has been looking at how to advance a reparative approach with these reconnecting communities projects, working with congressional staff and USDOT on that. A second hat I wear is I'm the coordinator for a national network, the Freeway Fighters Network. This is about several dozen local groups that are either advocating for reconnecting community solutions in their neighborhoods and or working towards stopping highway expansions in their neighborhood. Because when joining forces together, really, one of the, I think the big takeaways is, we can discuss later too, is, so many state DOTs with these expansion projects are still causing harm. And one solution, that I'd like to talk about is, we need to be stopping new harm, as the same time that we're looking at repairing historic harms.
Yes. Thank you all for joining and being here today. And I think the various angles of which you come to this work is definitely going to lead to a wonderful conversation. And so the first big question I'll direct to you, Randolph, is how can we address the cumulative harm at the intersection of transportation infrastructure and environmental justice?
So what I gave some of the background, but the more specific kind of work that we're doing that I failed to mention is that we're the lead community engagement firm for Vision 980, which is Oakland's reconnecting communities. And then we're also the lead in reconnecting Boston, the I-90 through Chinatown. It's both, so Oakland, specifically West Oakland, it's got elements of displacement and containment. It's, totally surrounded by freeways. And so what's my question? Tell me what my question.
So how can we address the cumulative harm? And
So
so
the
like you're working
cumulative
around a
harm. So
quantifying it.
yeah, again, I don't come from a research background, but most of the work that we're doing is research right now. We've got, some pillars that we're working around: enhanced community asset mapping, community engagement beyond, um, we call it community influence, because the community does not want to be engaged. They want to know that they have some influence on that project. The primary research is around the quantification of actual harm. And this is really putting a dollar figure on this. And this is beyond the acute harm of displacement through eminent domain. So we know we've got the spreadsheets of the parcels that were taken both by the 980 freeway, the 24 freeway, and the BART tracks, right? For anybody who knows the Bay Area, 503 homes in families in Oakland, 273. And so those numbers are easier to calculate, just the displacement piece, right? It's math, right? Housing value on one side or the other over the course of time, you do the math. But we're also looking at kind of health, specifically life expectancy. The life expectancy in those red line neighborhoods were probably 10 or 15. So now what's the value of a Black life? We're going to add that number up. We've got um, there's some other economic development issues, the EJ, but then there's also things like education, property values, and their relation to investments in schools. So what's the dollar cost of that loss in trajectory and academic attainment? There was over policing, and so we're looking at what's the value of taking kind of a working age man out of his home for X number of years. We're creating a data narrative, right? And so when we add all those numbers up, it's in the 20s of billions. And so then when we are working with the community, doing the community building, um, doing the technical assistance with the community, and they're showing up at the table, we're not coming up with $1 million solutions to $20 billion problems, right? And so that's one way that we are approaching that work.
Thank you. And so on the first panel, we heard about the quantification of homes themselves, but then with your work expanding beyond that, what are the health impacts? What are how do we quantify and give a dollar amount to these other harms? And we're seeing that if you do that for every city, it's definitely going to be even bigger. And so, yeah, definitely appreciate that work. And so, my next question is for Ben. What should the role of government be in repairing past harms? Should state governments be more involved? Is this a local responsibility? Who picks up the bill as Randolph is quantifying these harms? What should the role of government be?
I'm really glad I think the first panel touched on this question as well. It's a really thorny one, right? At the end of the day, the property and the facilities themselves are owned by a state or local government. And so, their involvement becomes necessary at some point. However, and we saw this with the Reconnecting Communities program, the federal one in particular. There was a sort of a disconnect between, how US DOT thought reconnecting communities would solve a lot of these problems and what happened on the ground. And the money largely went to a lot of state agencies that were responsible for the harms that these highways have caused. And now, it's not the same staff that built this highway back in 1960 or whatever, but they're representing the same agency or institution. They're coming into a neighborhood saying, we have this plan, to reconnect you all with the rest of your city. And so one thing that I know I've advocated for, and a lot of other folks have advocated for, as governments are setting up these programs, to really make sure that they're getting money, perhaps on the planning side, right? Rather than the capital construction side, planning money into the hands of frontline communities, whether that's nonprofits working with them, community-based organizations, getting that money into to create a process where community members can develop solutions. There's community developed plans that then ideally someone in a government agency can take and run with, right? That this is something that is not handed down from on high, but rather government enacting the will of the people in this case. And obviously that's easier said than done, and it becomes really tricky, to operationalize that. I think one place where we can start to look at that is the city of Syracuse and the New York State Department of Transportation currently undertaking a project to remove part of I-81 through downtown Syracuse and replace it with a surface road, a boulevard there. And there's a lot of lessons learned about communication and sort of lack of coordination between different agencies. I'd highly encourage you all. There's a PhD candidate at the University of Syracuse, Aditya Srinivasan, who is doing a lot of research on this. And he's looking at how, the Syracuse Housing Authority, this corridor, I-81 corridor, a lot of public housing along this corridor, a lot of residents who are confused by the I-81 removal project because it's happening at the same time as Syracuse Public Housing Authority is renovating its homes. And there's no coordination between the two. And so there's a lot of misconceptions about what's going on. All the while, NISDOT is using a lot of reparative language with this I-81 removal project. So yeah, I think it's one of what Aditya looks at in some of his research is how government authorities can work together and be on the same page. Because if one agency drops the ball, they essentially drop the ball for every agency that's working on that project or in that corridor. So looking at opportunities for government to also set up sort of a singular point of contact or authority as it's working with community members becomes really key.
And so that coordination across agencies, and as you mentioned, that's something that also got mentioned or was mentioned on the first panel. And also, like you're saying, investment in the actual communities to have community developed visions and plans. And so my next question, Yesenia, is for you is who should programs, and it's related, who should programs and investments be designed to support DOTs, frontline communities, both? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, this is definitely a both and question, but with really clear roles for both frontline communities and DOTs. Frontline communities are ultimately the beneficiaries of our public funding. And so they really should be the co-designers of our investments, which are points that both Randolph and Ben, you've touched upon. Especially frontline communities and communities who face the highest burden, they really need to be at the center of decision making as well as planning for projects. And the states should really be delivering on measurable improvements in air quality and opportunity as well as housing. And at the end of the day, what people care about most is really reducing traffic and making life more affordable. They want to know how this public transit or freeway is going to make their life better, right? So investment should really focus on shortening commutes, lowering transportation costs, and helping people stay rooted in their communities as opposed to displacing them when highway expansion projects occur. And I think that there's criticism around public participation as barriers to speed, but I think that's really a false trade-off and a false narrative because in reality, early and inclusive engagement can help reduce litigation more long-term, which can lead to gridlocking in permitting. So when we don't have projects without early and inclusive community input, that's when we have gridlock in projects, leaving lawsuits as really one of the only recourses for communities. So we need to be strengthening outreach early on. And I think to do that, we also need to build state capacity. So many DOTs are actually operating exactly how they were designed, right? They were structured around highway expansion. So if we want different outcomes, we really need to modernize how agencies operate and how funding operates right now. And we also need to be appointing forward-thinking leadership in these positions, and at the same time, continuing to resource communities so they can influence projects early. So, yeah, it's really we need capacity building at the DOT level as well as the frontline community level and really the grassroots level.
Thank you. And something uh, that you said, essentially, if you want different outcomes, you need different processes. And so I really appreciate that. And I think it leads to my next question for Randolph then. If we want different outcomes, in this case being repair, what does that even look like? What does repair for legacy residents look like? And I'll start with you, Randolph.
So one thing is kind of people's common understanding of the problem. So what we found is, and Ben and I have had this conversation, like kind of the freeway fighting, the environmental approach, is kind of different than what some of the legacy residents are talking about. And so we have to kind of dig a little deeper around community engagement. What we found in our work that we can't just rely on the community-based organizations. We certainly can't rely just on the institutions, right? Because in our instance, Caltrans created the problem, and so it creates a trust deficit within the community if they're now trying to come with a solution, right? And so the community engagement has to be done much differently. Again, moving from an engagement to an influence, moving from a relying on the community-based organization solely to hitting the street corners. These frontline communities are, often called hard to reach populations, and they're hard to reach for a population, for a reason, right? It costs more to get to them. It's a slower process, all the rest of that good stuff. Some of the most insightful community engagement I did was literally talking to some guys that were sitting out on the corner, right? And so, like, how do you operationalize that? Um, we are looking at some policy frameworks, new ways to look at existing policies and ordinances. Some of the work that is proposed and how the Reconnecting Communities project was laid out is that we were going to do, like we just finished a phase one. They put out an RFP for phase two. At that point, they were going to turn over the results and possibly reconvey the land to the city of Oakland to go through their planning process. And so, as I said, that's a super long process. I hope it gets done before I'm back on soft foods. You know what I mean? And so we really, really, really have to focus on the community building and the community governance, right? So the community governance piece and having an infrastructure around community governance, and that's the really the topic of the other ITS work that we're doing right now is around community governance because there are so many different competing community concerns, right? Even the freeway fighters versus the, dare we say, reparations folks, open spaces versus no, you took my home folks. There has to be some kind of a governance and mobilization strategy. And what I've said in response to many of the legacy residents, some of them are like, nope, don't do anything, right? Because fool me twice, shame on me, right? You took my home last time, right? You promised jobs, we didn't get them. You promised economic opportunity, you didn't get it. And it's just exacerbating the pace of gentrification, right? Most of the residents who experience the most harm are no longer in the neighborhood. It was probably 90%, 85% Black. Now it's about 25% Black, right? And so they're just very, very suspect, and we have to really understand that. So the whole way, and I'll say this, the best laid plans by the best planners have unintended consequences, right? And so if this cannot be an academic exercise, this cannot be taken lightly. That's all different than anything that has happened before. Certainly, it's not what happened, when the freeways were built, because there was literally no community engagement. We started this work with doing interviews with legacy residents. I started with the 95-year-old woman on down when West Oakland was a thriving and cohesive Black neighborhood. What did you have then? What do you have now? How was the community held together? So that none of that stuff happened, right? And in all of the efforts that I've been through, which is many, these large scale real estate and infrastructure projects, that really has not been done. So that's, I'm going to say, is really at the core of what needs to be done differently.
And so, again, rooted in the community, doing things differently. Of course, before, like you mentioned, there wasn't community process, now there is, but even that needs to be expanded upon. And what does that really mean? And so, completely what you agree with and understand that distrust, because we're saying that the solution is coming from the same agency that did create harm. And so, I do want to leave the audience with some hope, though. There is organizing, it is continuing. And so, could each of you highlight a successful freeway removal or transformation project? And I'll start with you, Ben, and then go around. And so, what is a successful freeway removal or transformation project then?
And one project I think has done really good, certainly not perfect job, but we're seeing improvements along the way, is the Inner Loop East removal in Rochester, New York, and the now ongoing Inner Loop North removal. In the Inner Loop East removal, it's a sunken highway, now gone, replaced by a two-lane street. The city was able to reclaim about 6.5 acres of land, put that land out for bid to developers. They built about 500 apartment buildings on that land, I think about half of which are designated affordable with particular services that people living adjacent to the highway wanted to see. And it's a really great project just for the vision of transformation. There's an excellent group in Rochester, New York, Hinge Neighbors Incorporated, that works across both sides of the highways, above the highway, and really provide some feedback to the city that was strongly worded. They've taken what was a barrier that was a trench and built a wall with these large apartment buildings. There wasn't really this was maybe a community development project, but it wasn't really taking into account a reparative aspect or a healing aspect. And now the city's looking at removing the northern part of the inner loop. Unlike the eastern part, was largely, no one was left around there. It was largely abandoned lots and buildings. There wasn't so much of a community directly adjacent to the highway. In the case of the Inner Loop North, there's two communities. On the south side, that's closer to downtown now, largely white community, a bit more affluent. On the north side, largely Black and Latino community, less affluent, a lot of renters. And so Hinge Neighbors is advocating to the city, we have to think about different ways of land ownership here, property ownership. How can we develop, smaller homes, whether that's single family homes, duplexes, that people can actually own, get some of those people who are renting right now into homes so they have a stake in that land. And they are, know that they can be settled there. And the city has really taken that feedback into account and been humble about this, which I think is a really necessary uh, quality for government members moving forward with these types of projects. So the Interloop North ongoing. I think we'll see a lot of positive things out of it, and we'll learn some more lessons. But that's where I would point you all to at the moment.
Thank you. So for those in the audience looking to Rochester, Yesenia?
Yeah, I'm going to answer this question a little bit differently. I know you wanted some optimism here, so I will try to weave that in. But I think one important shift that we're seeing isn't just around, transformative projects, but it's structural change, structural policy and program change. For example, with the SB 695 state transportation outcomes data that was previously mentioned, that required Caltrans to publicly report how many homes or businesses were demolished for highway expansion. This is very new, right? The first report came out in 2018. The first data was from 2018 to 2024, and the second data set came out earlier this year. And I think this transparency is really significant. We're also seeing local governments, grassroots organizations continue to fight against highway expansion, for example, in San Mateo, which I think this just signals a broader transformation around how success is defined. So, of course, the examples around like these transformation projects are really important. I see governance reform and public accountability as a critical transformation example. Um, I think that it's not enough to say we're investing in transportation solutions. We really need to be critical in what we're investing in and be critical if it's really necessary to build more at all. Dr. Reagan, you said it best early on when you said that California really embodies the contradiction of this moment around expansion, with the idea around like expand, baby, expand. And we really need to be stopping the harm before it even occurs. In the past 8 years alone, California has added over 800 miles of highway lanes. So to put it in perspective, that's the equivalent of the entire state of California running from Oregon to Mexico. And so we are spending billions and billions on transportation, but we're still ranking 47th in the nation. And so we really have to question the status quo, and we need to start building before the harm even occurs. So that's how I'm going to answer the question. And I guess the optimism is that we are seeing some governance reform, and I do have hope for what that can look like.
And I think that gets back to the first part is to name the harm. So the fact that we now even have these reports where they're like, these are the number of homes. And so hopefully that can lead to some kind of transformation. But I appreciate you weaving in the optimism. And Brandolph.
Let me just tell you, I'm typically unreasonably optimistic about most things. I'll just start with that, but I'm gonna have to continue on Yesenia's tepid optimism. And so we've seen a lot of projects in our work, just studying, and I would really need to know what the community's goals were to understand if whether or not it was successful, because typically it's a negotiated settlement, around community benefits and such. And I've been in a lot of community benefit agreements, which, it was just an agreement. It was not best case scenario. We're typically looking for a best case scenario right now. So what we're telling our community is, if there is a community benefit agreement, it has to be the biggest and best ever. If there is a preference program around housing, we've got to shoot for the moon. This is a moon. You don't get another opportunity. And just to give you an idea, we're talking about 67 acres of new buildable land in downtown West Oakland, which is probably some of the most valuable land in Oakland right now. And so I'm really optimistic about, kind of where we are in that. Um, I'm really excited about some of the work around, again, this is kind of new work. This 980 block party that we did, we're doing these large scale activations, and we did it, for those of you who are not in the area, at a business park created by Victorian homes that were picked up and moved there when the freeway was constructed, right? We're doing that. We've modeled the whole area, West Oakland and the 980 corridor, in Minecraft. And so we're deploying that with young people and elders working together. Yeah, we're not, and the last thing I'll say is we're redefining or reimagining best and highest use, right? And so, best and highest use, again, the best laid plans or the most well-intended plans typically go wrong for those highly impacted communities. So I'd hate to say that, the best plan that we've ever thought of, was the one that we're thinking of, but that's what I got. Sorry.
Well, thank you all, because I mean, it's grounded in realism. It's I appreciate sharing both the good and the bad, but also the potential for more and for us to do this even better. And so that brings me to the last question before I open it up to a brief Q&A before our breakouts is looking ahead, how can we achieve meaningful systems change in transportation planning? What strategies and approaches are promising for ensuring freeway removal and related investments genuinely repair harm and promote transportation justice? So this forward-looking, this vision's future, how do we achieve systems change?
Oh, I'm just going to reiterate the community piece of it, the activation, mobilization, and the technical assistance. I think that's the only way that they show up in a meaningful way, and that's the hardest part. But that's where our investment needs to go, right? So an informed, activated, mobilized community is going to impact who the legislators are, who are making the laws, who are making the decisions. They are going to determine what happens. They are a foil to any insufficient planning or planning not what's in the realm of possibility, but what people think can happen. There's typically a low bar for success with this kind of planning. They just want to get it done. I think the community can elevate that thinking. So for us, it's the power building amongst the community. I think that's the beginning and the end.
So it comes back to community. Any other thoughts? How can we achieve meaningful systems change in transportation planning? What are strategies and approaches that are most promising for repairing harm and promoting transportation justice?
I'm gonna follow Randolph's suggestion to be bold. And if there are any governors on this call, I dare you to pick this up. Put a moratorium on highway construction until we meet climate equity and maintenance goals. Shift that money elsewhere. Shift that money towards investments in community. Shift that money towards public transit. Shift that money towards safe streets. Highway building is very much an ideology. It's not the natural way of things. So we can change that. And we have in some places, right? Like I say a moratorium on highway expansion. It's happened before. It happened in 1970 in Massachusetts with the construction of I-95 through Boston, highly contested. Everyone from the Black Panthers to the Catholic Church to residents of the suburbs were against it. And Governor Sargent gets on TV and says, we were wrong. This is not the way to go forward. I'm declaring a moratorium on all highway construction within the I-495 corridor. I'm going to go down to DC and ask for this money to be traded in for public transit dollars. That happened. And I think, we need more bold approaches like that. More people willing to admit that we should do something differently. Because, the system that we have now was built over time, but it's built by people. And, that doesn't make it immutable or unchangeable. We can do better.
So put our money in alternative actual solutions. Yesenia?
Yeah, I love both these answers. I think if we want meaningful transformation, we really do need to be working at that systems change level. And I love this idea of, be bold in that. And we really have to do a lot of things at the same time. We need to be investing where the need is greatest and building the capacity to deliver and building those systems into place. I think funding has to follow the burden, which means setting clear investments for under-resourced communities and using transparent data that we now have available to guide those decisions. And I think the cap and trade funds are a good example of what that can look like where resources go to disadvantaged communities. And I think on the innovation side, we do have real tools available planning wise. We need to integrate housing, transportation, and land use decisions. So we're not solving congestion in one area with the highway widening, which, by the way, study shows that highway widenings don't actually solve congestion. So we're not, building highways, expanding highways, and then creating housing pressures at the same time. We really need to be thinking about these planning processes in a holistic way. And we really need to be thinking about reconnecting communities, not just about like the actual physical planning projects themselves, but shifting the investments, shifting the incentives, and really reforming the decision-making structures so that transportation can strengthen communities. Yeah, and just shifting funding away from harmful expansions towards good projects. The innovations are out there, there's ideas out there, and we just need to be co-designing with our communities.
Thank you. And so this gets back to where is our money going? What are these processes? The need for intersectional solutions, so not just transportation, but transportation, housing. Um, and so I appreciate all of your responses. And before we open it up to the breakouts, I do want to bring in this audience question of in all of this, in this community-driven planning, in these co-design projects, what are the roles for experts? What is the place of academic experts? On the earlier panel, we had practitioners. What are the role of experts in community-driven planning? And I should reframe this a little bit because I do think we need to also ensure that we acknowledge all forms of expertise. And so, what are specifically the roles of researchers, practitioners in community-driven planning? Since again, acknowledging that everyone has expertise.
Can I start with the glib answer?
Sure.
I would get over yourself. Because again, the most well-intended planners can cause harm because they have not listened. I typically say when you get enough smart people in the room, something's bound to go wrong. Right. And so again, these planning processes are typically bound by the resources of the planning process. That's why we have a dual process. I've got one role in managing the community engagement for this Caltrans contract, but we spent twice that through our nonprofit. We raised separate money so we can go deeper, deeper, deeper beyond what was in the scope of and it was working in collaboration, in coordination with. But we found that as much as we knew, we didn't know enough until we kind of got into the work. So I would just say, use your expertise for good. And don't be, kind of presumptive um, because it could run counter to the work.
So starting with community, listening to community, and this gets to my last question that I framed in my PowerPoint, how being in service to community and community-led visions. Any other responses?
Yeah, I can add there. I think, whether it's on the planning side, the policy side, the community side, everyone really does have a role. And I think we do need reframing around what it means to be an expert. Because of course, community is an expert in their own lived experience. And I think on the planning side, planners are really meant to be more like the translator and hold the vision for what community wants. And community really should be centered around the vision should be centered around community and their needs. I think community needs assessments specific to clean transportation or mobility are a great tool for how this can be done, like actually assessing the needs of the community and what projects they want before coming into a community, sharing the project with them, and then getting community input at that point. At that point, it's almost already too late because you didn't ask the community first. Um, so yeah, that's my 2 cents of it. I think experts need to be designing with community defined goals.
I could see experts in the traditional sense. I don't know, take an executive role, and by that I don't mean like CEO, but like you the execute a community-based plan, right? There's still a lot of complicated elements, funding mechanisms, blah blah blah, things like that, that experts are often needed to handle. But when it comes to like creating alternatives, and this is one of my biggest pet peeves in infrastructure planning is the alternative creation process are a list of 6 alternatives that are delivered to community members with the smallest little tweaks. Is the off-ramp planned 5 feet this way or 5 feet that way? Um, throwing out the not coming in with pre-cooked alternatives, I think would be a very radical and impactful change for the transportation planning process. And maybe this is a little tangential. I would love to see a Department of Transportation or state agency or local agency that's executing these types of projects. Um, I'd love to see them go canvass a neighborhood, be door knockers, be organizers, right? Nonprofits can do it, community-based organizations can do it. Just a bunch of neighbors who are interested in these projects, they go out and they knock on doors and they talk to people and meet them where they're at. The traditional experts should be doing the exact same thing, getting out there and canvassing and talking. And I think this, to Yesenia's point, like that's how you break down some of these later barriers that come up to project implementation because you haven't talked to enough people and figured out, what their stake in this is.
And I'm sorry, with that, you just have thick skin.
No.
Just have very, very thick skin and patience. And only because we've said community 1,000 times today, understand that it is communities that might be 2 or 10, which exponentially complicates, your work just in terms of time and resources, which is why we feel like there has to be a community governance. There has to be some kind of an organization within the community to create some cohesiveness, and accounting for all of the different perspectives.
Well, thank you. And so thank you so much to our Session 2 panelists taking us through how do we address cumulative harm? What does repair actually look like? And it really comes down to how do we change the process because it's only then that we will achieve systems change. And so, what do we need in terms of new governance structures, shifting from community empowerment to community influence, and really centering community in decision making, the co design, co development, and even the leading of these designs and visions for then planners to execute the said visions. And so thank you so much. And for everyone, they will be sticking around for our breakout session. So if there are additional questions, please feel free to raise them during the breakouts.